So we're in the middle of a series we just started last week called A Second Look at the Good Book, or another way to say that is the story of the Bible. What we're talking about is how we got the Bible in its current form. And this is a great series, and it's so important to talk about this because most people know some Bible stories, but very few people know the story of the Bible, about how it ended up where it is today. And this may actually surprise some of you, all right? This may surprise you, but Jesus didn't actually write anything in the Bible. Not one, all right? But Jesus is the reason that we have the book to begin with. He's the whole reason for it. If Jesus had stayed dead, there would be nothing to write about. Jesus' resurrection was the reason that these people started to write down and document their experiences with Jesus and what he had taught and what he had done. It wasn't because he did cool miracles. It was because of the resurrection. And when the followers of Jesus saw him alive again after they'd seen him die, they decided they had got to write this down. And so we said last week we have these 4 different accounts. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these accounts of Jesus' life. And this is something else we said last week. It is so unusual to have multiple accounts of the same event in the ancient world. There are no other ancient events that are documented as well as the resurrection and death of Jesus. That's just remarkable in human history. So Matthew, we said, was written to Jewish people. Mark is Peter's account, very action-oriented and fast-paced, short. Luke, we talked about last week, Luke is the guy who collected and interviewed people and as a historian wrote it down for his friend Theophilus. And then John, we said, John told us that he wrote his account so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And these accounts were all written at different times and by different people, but they were immediately considered by the church, they were immediately considered valuable and reliable. And the reason is because the readings were so valuable to people because they actually changed people's lives. Like people would read Matthew's account and their life would be changed. They would read John's gospel and they would not be the same person as they heard it talked about and preached in their little small Jesus gatherings. And they were considered reliable because they came from these eyewitnesses who were actually there and knew about all the events that had occurred. They were considered sacred and inspired. And it didn't take too long, friends, it didn't take too long before they were actually considered part of the scriptures themselves. Now, when the people sat down to write these accounts, they did not sit down to write the Bible, okay? Mark, Luke, they did not sit down and say, I think I'll write the Bible. They were just writing an account of Jesus' life or writing letters to churches. Now, today, this is what we talked about last week. Today, what I want to do is talk about the Old Testament. Because how in the world did a bunch of followers of Jesus end up incorporating the Old Testament? Well, what happened was that as the church began to spread, at first it was all Jewish believers, and then it began to spread in the Roman Empire, and a lot of non-Jews, Gentiles, began to convert to followers of Jesus. They began to follow Jesus. And when they did that, when they discovered Jesus, when the Gentiles discovered Jesus, they became interested in a particular Jew, Jesus. And when that happened, they also became interested in the sacred texts of the Jews. They became interested in the sacred texts of the Jews. And so the Gentiles had never before paid attention to the Jewish religion. I mean, most Gentiles didn't give a hoot what these Jews in Judea believed. They didn't pay any attention to that. And the Jews weren't really evangelists either. The Jews weren't evangelizing people. They lived separate lives, the Jewish people did. They had separate food, separate marriages. They did not marry Gentiles. They had a separate calendar that they followed. In fact, you read the Bible, it was 15 years after the resurrection of Jesus before Peter ever even stepped into a Gentile house. He'd never even been in one before, till 15 years after the resurrection. So the Gentiles became followers of Jesus, and at that point there was no Old Testament like you and I understand it. But there were these scrolls that were called the Law and the Prophets. The Law and the Prophets. And the Gentiles began reading those scrolls, and they discovered that the Jews had been worshiping one God all along. For thousands of years, the Jews had been worshiping only one God, Yahweh. And every other culture in the world, every other culture was worshiping multiple gods or ancestors. They had all these deities. And like if you moved from one place to another, you just pick up your gods, put them in a bag, go to your new place, take your gods out of the bag and set them up again. And then whatever gods they worshiped in that community, you just add them to your old ones. So you had some new gods and some old ones and just mixed them all up. The Jewish scriptures were shockingly different. Shockingly different. Moses begins the book of Genesis. He says, in the beginning, God. Now, there are profound implications of that very simple statement. This was shocking to the ancient world because everybody expected it to say, in the beginning, gods. The gods did something. Now, we aren't shocked by this. When you hear this, you're like, yeah, I've heard all that before. Our shock isn't about the God singular. Our surprise when we read Genesis is the creation part. Like, how did that happen? Is it 7 days? Is it 1,000,000 years? How does evolution play into that? But for most of Western history, Genesis was actually considered a fairly reliable historical record of what had happened back then. But in the early 1900s, some major doubts began to creep in to a lot of people's minds because archaeologists discovered that there were creation stories from a bunch of different ancient civilizations. The Babylonians, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, they all had their own creation story. And they were kind of similar to Genesis. In fact, they were so similar that for a while, the general scholarly consensus was that the Hebrews must have just borrowed their stories from all the other culture stories. The Hebrews just borrowed the Babylonian stories and changed the names. I actually learned this in history classes that I took. This was the prevailing theory that I was taught. Genesis just a copy of Babylonian and Egyptian myths. They just changed the names. Genesis wasn't unique. All these ancient accounts had stories about creation and flood and human tragedy. But after about 20, 30 years of this assumption, people actually began to read Genesis and compare it with these ancient accounts. And that assumption began to change. In fact, now this has largely been abandoned. This isn't really taught anymore. Genesis is not the same at all with those other creation accounts. Genesis is markedly, startlingly different from other ancient creation stories. It's just a very different account. So remember, originally Moses is writing to the enslaved Israelite people, okay, the Jews coming out of Egypt. And they had been worshiping the Egyptian pantheon of gods. Amun-Re and Hotep and the sun god and the moon god and the Nile River god. And so Moses begins his account by saying, in the beginning, God created. One God. Not a pantheon of gods. One God. Moses wants the Jewish people to become atheists towards those other gods. He wants them instead to believe that there is only one God, not a pantheon. Genesis's first objective was monotheism, which was a radical worldview in the ancient world. No one else was monotheistic. This idea that there was only one God. So Genesis has this startling contrast. Now, the second startling contrast with Genesis was, especially with those other creation stories that I mentioned a little while ago, was that all those other accounts had these epic battles among the gods, right? There was all this fighting with each other, and the gods were jealous and warring, and things were chaotic, and the gods were kind of petty. In fact, one of the most famous ones is the Babylonian creation story involves a god named Marduk. And this was all discovered in the early parts of the 19th century, the 20th century, in the early 1900s. They found these clay tablets that had the story of Marduk in the Babylonian creation myth. And there's basically, the way the story goes, there's a rebellion among the gods. The gods are warring with each other, right? And so Marduk steps forward and says, I will put down the rebellion and I will restore order to the cosmos. If you make me your chief god once I put down the rebellion. So they all agree. So Marduk goes to battle against the enemy goddess Tiamat, and they fight this epic cosmic battle, and Marduk eventually fires an arrow down Tiamat's throat, and it cuts her body in half, and Marduk takes the upper half and he throws it into the heavens, and that becomes the stars and the moon and the planets. And then he takes the lower half of her body and he throws it down and it becomes the earth and all the living creatures. Man, Babylonian Sunday school was cool. Do not miss Babylonian Sunday school. These epic battles, right? But Genesis introduces a radically unique worldview because Genesis is nothing like that. Nothing like that at all. There's no chaos. There's no petty conflicts. There's no physical or heavenly world being created by the body parts and death of other gods. Instead, in Genesis, there's only one God. And here's what he says. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God speaks the creation into existence from nothing. We call this ex nihilo. From nothing, God creates everything. Reality itself conforms to the command of God. And I have to just beg you, don't miss the contrast that Genesis is trying to set up with these other creation accounts. Yahweh alone is responsible for all of creation. And this uniqueness in Genesis doesn't end there. In the other creation accounts, people, you and I, afterthoughts, not central to the story. In fact, not only are they afterthoughts, they're byproducts of the war among the gods. Or worse, people are just slaves to serve the lazy gods. So in the Enuma Elish that we talked about a little while ago, the Babylonian creation story, I want you to hear what Marduk says when he decides to create people. Listen to this quote. This is Marduk in the Enuma Elish. He says, I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Savage man I will create, and he will be charged with the service of the gods, that the gods might be at ease. In the Enuma Elish, people, you and I, are an afterthought. We only exist just to make life easy for the gods up in the heavens. Because of the way people are created in those other accounts, people have no worth, no dignity, no value. Women, no status at all. And power-hungry, violent, unjust kings and rulers, well, those earthly kings, they're just imitating the gods in the heavens. All they're doing is what they see the ones up above doing. They kill, they conquer, they rule over the weak, they take from the poor, they amass wealth and power, because that's what the gods do up in heaven. Genesis stands completely apart from those other creation accounts. Genesis teaches what no other pagan myth ever did. God said, let us make mankind in our image. In the Jewish text, people are the pinnacle of creation. They're not an afterthought. All modern, don't miss this, friends, all of our modern concepts of equality, dignity, worth of the individual human, they all come from Moses. God declares people valuable from the very beginning, made in God's image. And what comes next in Genesis is even more remarkable, friends. That in contrast to every other pagan creation myth for thousands of years, Moses taught that people were created to rule over creation. To rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky, the livestock and all the wild animals. God told his people, don't worship nature. Don't worship the creation. Do not make idols out of the rocks and the trees. Instead, you are to rule over. Another translation for that, steward, care for. You have been entrusted with the creation. You are God's representatives. You are God's image bearers to the world around you. But every other pagan culture was worshiping nature. They were worshiping weather. They were worshiping the trees, the gold, the stone, the mountains. And God establishes a completely unique worldview. And then God created people in his image, male and female in his image. Ladies, can I have your attention? Ladies, listen. Only Yahweh gave dignity and worth to both men and women. Think about the modern feminist movement, the Me Too movement, the idea that women should have dignity and value in our culture. Our world is still trying to catch up with what Moses taught 4,000 years ago. We're still trying to catch up with what God said at the very beginning. Now, here's something remarkable. When modern people read Genesis, we so often completely miss all of the points I just talked about. We completely miss the significance of that. You and I read these texts and we miss the main point. And the reason for that is actually kind of ironic. Think about this. When Moses wrote Genesis, friends, Moses was trying to persuade ancient people of something completely shocking and unbelievable. That there was only one God, that people have dignity and worth, and that God is the creator of the universe. That was bizarre and shocking to ancient people. That there's an ordered and a thoughtful creation. It's not random chaos. The humans are stewards of creation, not slaves to the gods. Completely shocking. But none of that shocks you and I. And do you want to know why we're not surprised by that? Because Moses' worldview won. Do you understand, friends? Moses' worldview, our worldview today, is stolen from Moses. That people have dignity, human rights, and worth. We take all that for granted. But they came from Moses and Jesus' teaching based on Moses. That's not the only thing that we got from Moses. We also got the concept of ex nihilo creation, creation from nothing. Because Aristotle from about the 300s BC on, almost every philosopher and scientist in the world believed that the universe was eternal. This was actually the scientific theory for this was called the steady state model is what it was called. That the universe is static, it's always been the same, and it's existed for eternity. This was Einstein's belief, actually. Einstein was a believer in the steady state model of the universe. Then Edwin Hubble came along, and we named the telescope after him, the Hubble Telescope. Edwin Hubble came along and observed that all of the galaxies in the whole universe were actually moving apart from one another, which means that if you played the tape backwards, they all move towards each other if you look back in time. And this is where this theory, you may have heard of this new theory that just shocked everybody in the world. It was called you heard this, the Big Bang Theory? Not the TV show. The TV show is named after this theory, all right? This idea that in a trillionth of a second, all matter in the universe basically exploded into existence from a finite point of nothingness. And this just rocked the science world completely because nobody saw this coming. And many scientists, including Einstein, did not like the Big Bang Theory. They resisted it. And the reason they didn't like it is because it sounded way too much like, in the beginning, God. What Moses had said 4,000 years previous. So Moses' worldview, it actually won. Moses' worldview won out in our modern world today. But we still struggle when we read Genesis. When you and I read Genesis, we struggle as modern people. And one of the reasons we struggle with Genesis is because we bring some bad assumptions to the text, all right? Modern people struggle because they assume that Moses is trying to explain how God created the heavens and the earth. Oh, Moses is explaining how it happened. That's not what Moses is doing. Moses is writing to ancient people who didn't know anything about physics or mathematics. They had no ability to understand how God had created the universe around them. They didn't understand that. Moses was not trying to teach how God created the universe. Moses was trying to teach that a single monotheistic God had created everything from nothing, and that this God, Yahweh, had infused people with dignity and worth and had a vastly different value system and purpose than all the other existing worldviews of the time. Friends, Moses drops a bomb on the ancient world. He introduced a completely new and radically different worldview. That there is one personal God, that you, friends, are created in God's image with worth and dignity, not to be slaves, but to have a relationship with that God who created you. And that now we are to represent God to the creation by being salt and light to the world around us. And friends, that led to a whole new value system. Listen to this. Every person you meet, all the people sitting around you right now in this room, men, women, and children, Moses' worldview says that those people are not an accident of nature. that they're not an afterthought of uncaring gods. That every person you meet and who's sitting around you right now is an image bearer of God, their Father. And that means we better be careful how we treat those people. See, according to the Enuma Elish, according to the Babylonian story, you're just a slave to the gods. No dignity, no worth, no afterlife, no redemption, no hope. Fascinatingly enough, according to the most popular modern secular worldview, modern secularism, you're born a slave to your DNA. You're just the evolutionary yearnings of chemical processes in your brain and body. Or you're a slave to your racial identity or your class struggle or your gender identity. No choices, no purpose in any of those choices, no meaning, no redeemer, no hope. And there, in contrast to these views, sitting quietly nearby, sits Genesis. In the beginning, God. Genesis introduces a God who calls you by name. A God who loves and saves. A God who invites you into a relationship with him and invites you to follow and obey because of what he's done to redeem and save you. A God who gives a brand new monotheistic worldview. A brand new worldview, a grand meta-narrative for our lives that provides the ultimate context for human meaning and purpose in the world. That provides a purposeful world and answers the most important questions that we have. Like, why is there something rather than nothing? Or why do we exist? What's the purpose of our existence? It's not a result of the war among the gods. You were not created to be a slave to the gods. You're not an accidental byproduct of random processes in DNA. You're here with a purpose, for a purpose, on purpose. Because God created you, friends. He created you as his image bearers. Your life is meaningful because of what God has done for you. And if all that wasn't enough, God did the most unbelievable thing. When humans rejected their creator, when humans rejected the God who created them, God took the initiative to reverse the curse, to become one of us. The painter became part of the painting. The sculptor became part of the sculpture. God took on human flesh, and through the God-man Jesus came to redeem what was broken. And this profound and startling truth so fascinated the Gentile followers of Jesus that they began to study the Old Testament. They wanted to know where this Jesus had come from. And they discovered all that the Jews had been saying all along, that the Jewish Messiah was found in the prophecies of the Jewish scriptures. And Christians, followers of Jesus, began to adopt the Jewish scriptures as their own. And now the stage was set for the inclusion of the Old Testament along with the writings of the New Testament about Jesus. But I know I still haven't answered the most important question that many people have. The modern question that people struggle with. Then how did God create the universe? Was it 6 days? Was it 1,000,000 years? Was it 1 billion? Was it random? Was it purple? Were Adam and Eve real? Were they never? Not Moses' point when he wrote Genesis. It wasn't the point of the writing. And honestly, I have read and watched more about this issue than I can imagine. Hundreds of hours of my life I've spent poring over this issue. I honestly don't care anymore. It's enough to know that God is the creator, that we have been created in his image, that we have fallen into sin, and God has sent a redeemer. There's been too much time spent arguing over this, trying to nail it down. Too much energy wasted on something that was not central to the message of Jesus. And look, if you decide that you want to nail this down, if you want to read all the books and you want to watch all the debates, wrestle with the steady state, eternal universe, the multiverse, string theory, the Big Bang theory, hey, good luck trying to crack that nut. All right, good luck to you. I'll leave you with the Dread Pirate Roberts. Get used to disappointment. There are lots of unanswered questions, friends, in this world. I can actually recommend some helpful books that will help you wrestle this to the ground a little bit. But even if you knew, would it really make any practical difference in your life? My suggestion is, when you encounter those issues that are stumbling blocks, get a box, a question box in your head, write those down and stick them in the box, and then when you meet Jesus face to face, ask him yourself. Until then, there's work to be done. Next week, friends, please don't miss next week, because if you've ever struggled with the Old Testament, and you've said to yourself, man, I don't get it. There's these barbaric people and oppressive laws and an angry God and all this violence. What are we supposed to do with the Old Testament? Next week, we're going to answer that question.